What does it feel like to live in a place where you're punished for telling the truth? Where people you deeply trust betray you, and where you're driven to destroy the things that mean the most to you? I found out, unexpectedly, in Rwanda. I went to Rwanda to write a book, and I'd heard only good things about the country. I'd heard it was a beautiful country, that it was calm, peaceful, even a little boring. I'd heard the economy was on the rise after the genocide in 1994, and I was given a chance to train a group of journalists. But one day, a journalist colleague told me that there were thousands of homeless people in the countryside. I hadn't heard about this or read anything about it in the press. So when he offered me the opportunity to see for myself, I accepted. We traveled by bus and then by motorcycle, and after we'd risen and fallen over countless green hills, we arrived at a school where we left our motorcycles and began to walk. And here we came upon a scene of sudden destruction. There were thousands of people out in the open. It was a rainy season, and they were sick with pneumonia and malaria. The elderly and the young were dying. Their huts were roofless. Some huts had been destroyed entirely, and all you could see was a circular trace on the ground. It didn't make any sense to me because the thatch on the roof, from the roof, was on the ground, and the people could have put it back up. But they didn't. They just sat there. And though the place looked like a war zone, there was no sign of any violence. There were no tank treads, no bullet wounds, no bullet holes on the walls. So what had happened here? I found a cement house, one of the few in the village. And inside, I found families stuffed into rooms with goats and pigs for lack of space. A father came out of one of the rooms, and I asked him, "Who did this to you? Who destroyed your homes? Was it the army? Was it the police? Tell me who did this to you." And his answer was one I never would have expected. He said, "We did." The president of Rwanda had ordered it, and the people had obeyed. The president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, had called these thatch roof huts primitive, and local chiefs, desperate to please their leaders, had ordered people to go out and destroy their own homes. Some of these families had lived in these homes for generations, and they took them apart with their own hands. And after they'd done this, they said that they had done a good job. Rwanda is a state of deep surveillance. The entire country is divided into little villages. Each village has about 100 or 150 families. Each village has a chief and an informer, and orders pass from the center to and from these villages very efficiently. You see the level of control in benign things. When the president bans plastic bags disappear overnight. When he tells people to wear rubber slippers, they wear rubber slippers overnight. And when he tells people to come out and vote, they turn out in numbers unheard of. Participation rates of 98%. Of course, the president wins nearly 100% of the vote. A small-town pastor, distressed at what he was seeing, told his congregation not to destroy their homes until replacement houses had been built. He was arrested shortly afterwards for threatening national security. There is no free press in Rwanda. The people know there's no one is listening to them. And when people are denied access to a free press, they can come to destroy the things that are most dear to them, even their homes. There was another moment in Rwanda when society did itself harm. The genocide in Rwanda killed nearly 1 million people. Rwandans killed each other. And the genocide was given force by this same system of villages. When the government issued the order to kill, the genocide began almost simultaneously across the country. Each village received the order to kill and sent their people out. Those who opposed government orders were silenced or themselves killed, until there was only a single voice in the country, the voice of the government. Rwanda today is not so different. Among the students I taught, none are practicing. One of my colleagues was shot dead on the day he criticized Paul Kagame. 2 young women were sent to prison for several years for insulting Kagame. 2 others fled the country, fearing for their lives. Others have joined the presidential propaganda team or simply abandoned journalism because it's too dangerous for them and their families. I've documented more than 60 journalists who over the last 20 years have fled the country, been imprisoned, tortured, disappeared, or killed. Some have even been killed in exile. That's one journalist every 4 months. One of my students was Gibson. He was a sharp guy and a wonderful writer. And after he criticized the government, he began to be pursued. As he fled the capital, he was tracked down by the same network of surveillance. Every place he went to, he was informed on. Every hotel he stayed in transmitted his information. Where was he going to hide? And so one evening, when he was in a faraway city, in a small hotel, he heard a knock on his door. He opened the door and found it was another one of my students. He said, "What are you doing here?" And the friend said, "Oh, I'm just traveling." Shortly afterwards, his friend called someone and said, "I'm with him." That night, Gibson sent me a text message saying, "I think I'm going to die tonight." Gibson paid for his hotel room, switched hotels, and because he had nowhere else to go, I told him to come home. The night before he fled the country, Gibson taught me how to look in a dictatorship. We were standing outside my house, and he pointed to a well-lit, well-paved road, a symbol of Rwanda's progress. But Gibson said, "Where are all the people? There were no people on that wonderful road. The people had all chosen to walk on our road, dark, without streetlights, cobblestone where they could trip and fall." Gibson told me that people avoided those well-lit roads because they saw them as places of government surveillance, where the government could pick them up. Kagame has been praised for building such roads. He's been praised for a parliament that has a majority of women. The parliament has no power. He's been praised for many things that we know dictatorships can accomplish. He's been praised for modern buildings, for growing the economy, for a healthcare system. Of course, if you criticize the government, you lose everything. And meanwhile, the dictatorship destroys institutions like the free press, like the judiciary, raising the prospect of future violence. On New Year's Day, Kagame announced he would stand for a third term as president, breaking previous promises to respect what had been a 2-term limit. The new constitution allows him to stay in power until 2034. That's 40 years in total. In a classic dictator speech, Kagame said, "The people have asked me to stay. I can only accept." His political opponents are all either out of the country, in prison, or dead. So there's no opposition in Rwanda today. And despite all this, Kagame was recently invited by Harvard University to speak on the topic of democracy. He was also invited by Yale University this month for his leadership in human rights. He's also spoken at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, closer to home here. To those who know dictatorship, it can be easy to see through this facade. I remember during the 2010 presidential elections, which I covered, at an opposition rally, a woman was organizing the campaign, and she was so afraid that people would actually believe that she supported the opposition candidate, that even as she organized the opposition rally, she wore a t-shirt of Kagame. And when you asked her who she was going to vote for, she said Kagame. I remember a Russian UN worker whom I met 3 days after he arrived in the country. I asked him, "What do you think of Rwanda?" And he laughed and he said, "It's just like the Soviet Union. I opened the newspaper this morning and there's only good news." So where is the bad news? It can feel incredibly lonely living in a dictatorship. Even in the capital, in crowded markets, when you can't speak of a brother or sister who disappeared or was killed. It can feel incredibly lonely when everyone around you describes this silence of fear as peace. When everyone describes those well-lit roads, those empty roads, as signs of progress. It can feel incredibly lonely when you're asked to destroy your own home. As one Rwandan told me, we don't know where the state ends and where we begin. It is this sense of isolation that gives the government great power over people and allows these crimes to be committed. It's reached a point where the people are inflicting the crimes upon themselves on government orders. And it is this sense of loneliness and isolation that we begin to break down in places like this, when we speak to each other, when we share, and when we seek out not only what the government shows, but also the many crimes that it hides. Thank you.